We are here with Congressman Jamie Raskin from Maryland's 8th Congressional District. And thank you, Congressman Raskin, for agreeing to this interview.
My pleasure, Paul.
You have gotten pretty high profile lately. You're on the Oversight Committee, you're on the Judiciary Committee. In addition, you've been on CNN and MSNBC quite often. It's reassuring to the Montgomery County residents that the rest of the country is finally getting to understand what a treasure trove of knowledge and information you are that we already knew. Although I will tell you, if you get a few more thousand appearances on CNN, you'll be approaching Eric Swalwell, so you have a few to go.
Well, don't worry, I'm not running for president.
What we wanted to focus on is, and you are a constitutional law expert, we want to focus on your perspective on messaging, democratic messaging, for the upcoming 2020 presidential election, regardless of who the nominee is. And so my first question deals with controlling the narrative. If you remember back in 2004, the Republicans controlled the narrative. All of a sudden, Swift boat was the issue. In 2016, it was Hillary's emails. In 2020, clearly it's going to be, whoever the nominee is, they're going to be labeled as a socialist, even though it's not clear that the Republicans even understand what the word means. My question to you is, how do we get back the narrative to control that and not let them, and put them on the defensive rather than always us being on the defensive?
Well, thank you for having me, Paul. I'm delighted you came down to visit me in my office. Well, let's start with this. The critical thing is not the electoral messaging, but of course, getting the people's work done as much as we can under a very tough configuration of political forces, with the Republicans still controlling the Senate and the presidency, of course. But we have actually been making remarkable progress here in the House. We passed the first gun safety legislation in more than 2 decades to close the internet loophole and the private gun show loophole, to have a universal criminal and mental background check on all firearm purchases. We are hopeful and we are fighting to see that that Senator McConnell will bring this legislation to the floor so we can actually begin to reduce the unacceptable death toll in our society based on both spectacular episodes of mass violence in public places and then also just the daily routine 100 people a day being killed by handguns. So that's one example. We have voted to cut off any cooperation with Saudi Arabia in its brutal, bloody war in Yemen. We voted on that yesterday. We reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act. We are fighting to try to restore basic environmental protections at a time when the president is stripping environmental protections and undoing the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act regulations. So I guess our principal message, if you will, is that we're fighting for America and we're fighting for the things that actually make our society strong. Now, you know, in terms of what our message will be to the public in 2020, obviously that's still a ways off, but I'll tell you the way I'm trying to frame this very difficult moment that we're in. The President of the United States has tried to turn the government of the U.S. into a money-making operation for himself, for his family and friends, and for his close business associates. And they've turned over every federal department to a money-making interest that was supposed to be regulated by it. The for-profit colleges are running the Department of Education. The big oil and big gas and the fracking interests and the timber and mining interests have taken over the Departments of Interior and Energy, and so on. That's their vision of government. We want government to be an instrument of the public interest and the common good for everybody. That's democracy. That's not socialism. Anything that advances the common good for the masses of people, they call socialism. They called Medicare socialism. They called Social Security socialism. They called Medicaid socialism. So I think the American public is on to that trick. We know that they support socialism for the wealthiest people in the country and the big banks and corporations, and rugged individualism for everybody else. But we support a government that is actually going to serve the American people. And we're not going to run away from that. That's who we are. And we have given America the 40-hour work week. We've given America child labor laws. We've given America Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and the civil rights laws. That's who we are.
Right.
And they'll have to run on their opposition to all those things.
As long as we make it clear that, I mean, socialism, my understanding is technically government control of production and distribution. That's clearly not what we have in this country.
Nobody is talking about socializing the means of production. The only people who want the government to play that role are actually the Republican Party and the big banks, who want the government to bail them out every time that they crash the economy.
Right. That's socialism that we don't want.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the Mueller report. Somebody who you know quite well, Brian Frosch, Attorney General of the state of Maryland. When he ran as the people's attorney, not as the governor's attorney. Barr clearly is basically Roy Cohn for Trump now. That's what he's looking for when he fired Sessions, and now he got his Roy Cohn. A couple of things. As far as the report goes, which we haven't seen yet, but in the synopsis, the Barr synopsis, it does indicate that Russia, not a 400-pound guy sitting in New Jersey, influenced the election.
Yes.
Instead of us reacting to the no collusion, and the no obstruction, why aren't we holding the Republicans' feet to the fire on what are you doing about the other aspect of the report, which is the Russian interference in the election?
But we're not going to be able to make that real to people until they finally get to read the report, until we all get to see it. And I keep saying we don't need the Cliff Notes version of Macbeth, especially if it's written by the witches. We need
right.
We need Macbeth in itself, in all of its lurid and vivid detail. And of course, the press is reporting, the New York Times and the Washington Post are reporting, that Mueller's actual prosecutors are furious and livid about this distorted characterization of the Mueller report, which obviously William Barr has presented to the public in his 4-page press release. It's just completely unacceptable. The report itself needs to be turned over to us the way every other independent counsel and special counsel
right.
has done, and that's our constitutional entitlement right. As the Congress of the United States. So there is a lot in that report that we're going to read, assess, digest, respond to, and get out to the public. We've got to. Look, if it provided the complete and total exoneration that Donald Trump is talking about, they would have made copies for every man, woman, and child in the United States of America and delivered it to their doorstep. That report is not remotely an exoneration. You know, on obstruction, for example, it sounds to me, reading between the lines of the Barr whitewash, that actually Mueller said that there was substantial evidence, if not probable cause, to find that there was obstruction, but he left the legal conclusion alone because his boss, in this sense, the Attorney General of the United States, is saying, one, we don't prosecute the president, and two, the president can't be guilty of obstructing justice. So he left the ultimate legal conclusion alone. The Attorney General, in his apparently infinite wisdom and rush to defend the president, simply declared the president wasn't guilty of obstructing justice, which he had already done in his 19-page single-spaced memo.
Right. I suspect that when the report finally does come out, that it'll indicate a series of things that are impeachable offenses, which may not have risen to going beyond a reasonable doubt standard. You know?
We just don't know. It may very well be, but we just don't know, and it doesn't help to speculate. We shouldn't have to guess. This is not written in hieroglyphics. It's written in English. Right. Give us the report.
Right. As far as the Attorney General position goes, though, it is different than the other cabinet members. Do you see any possibility of the Attorney General position being an elected office in the future?
Well, it would require a constitutional change to create a new elective office. Here's the thing. I mean, Donald Trump has obviously violated and upended every constitutional and political and ethical norm we've got. One of those norms was that the President of the United States does not interfere directly in ongoing criminal investigations. The President has obviously shattered that, interfering not only in ongoing criminal investigations, but in ongoing criminal investigations that relate to him. That's astounding and extraordinary. Well, he found his Roy Cohn, because what we've got is an Attorney General who not only has tolerated and accepted and collaborated with the President in that process, but who defends that and says that because of the so-called unitary executive theory, the President is in charge of everything that goes on in the law enforcement function because he's President of the United States.
Yeah. Right. Okay. All right. Well, let's jump over to health care. Healthcare was the biggest issue of the 2018 midterms, right? And clearly that's a key issue. Where do you stand on, and I know this is something that the candidates are juggling with, where do you stand on Medicare for all versus a public option? Let's
start with this. We are aggressively defending the Affordable Care Act against a president who repeatedly has sworn to destroy it and has tried as recently as a couple days ago and submitted briefing in a case to say that the entire Affordable Care Act should be struck down. We just passed a resolution saying we are going to defend it with everything we've got. We are going to defend the core of it, which is protection for pre-existing condition patients against being thrown off of their health insurance. That's an elementary principle of democratic solidarity. And in fact, the fact that people have pre-existing medical conditions is the reason why they need insurance. It's not the reason to throw them off of their insurance, right? So, so we're going to defend what we've got. We are going to improve the Affordable Care Act by making it more affordable, by making it more accessible, by reducing the cost of the co-pays and the deductibles to patients, because the insurance premiums are just getting out of control, as well as the costs of paying to go get your health care. So we're going to work on doing that. Obviously, the Republicans, not only are they not interested in moving to a Medicare for All program, they're trying to slash Medicare and they're trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act. But I do believe that the current system is unaffordable. We're going to do whatever we can to squeeze the inefficiencies out of it and to make it more affordable for people. But I think ultimately we're going to have to move to the kind of system that works all over the world, right, in Canada, in Europe, in pretty much every other country, where they're not spending 30 to 35 cents on the dollar on private insurance bureaucracy and administration.
As an aside, back on November 7th, he did hold a full press conference in the White House, and I did get a question in. I don't know if you ever saw that clip. It was right after Jim Acosta had his to-do with the president. And my question was to the president was, how do you keep the cost of premiums down and cover pre-existing conditions by doing away with the individual mandate, which is essential to fund those things?
Yeah.
And of course, his answer was no answer. He said increasing competition, the individual mandate was the worst thing in the world. But my question to you is, if it does get to Roberts ruled in favor of the Affordable Care Act because he said that that individual mandate was a tax and the government has the right to do the tax. If they do away with that, where do you think, if it does get to the Supreme Court, how do you think, what's the basis of a ruling?
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court in the ACA case had said that Congress could not compel participation in the program under its Commerce Clause power. You don't regulate commerce by creating commerce. The court said the only hinge for the constitutionality of the program was the fact that the court, despite what Congress had said, was willing to treat it as a tax. Now that the Republicans have eliminated the mandate, arguably, according to the Republicans, there's no tether left for the constitutionality of the program. That's why they're arguing that the whole thing is unconstitutional. They are trying to destroy it. I happen to believe that Congress has the power to regulate commerce and to compel participation in a program that it has trillions of dollars of effect on interstate commerce across the country, and I thought that decision on the Commerce Clause point was ridiculous.
Yeah, okay.
So that's our position, but they are clearly hell-bent on trying to destroy the ACA. There's no doubt about that.
It's frightening when we have to rely on Roberts as the swing vote, but that's another. So let's jump to the wall, all right? The National Emergencies Act of 1976 was clearly intended for emergencies where you didn't have enough time to go through the regular appropriations process. Here, he's declaring one to circumvent the appropriations process. How do you think that's going to end up if it does work its way to the Supreme Court?
Well, the Emergencies Act legislation from 1976 has been used by every other president to address a real emergency, a hurricane, an earthquake, a war, in order to respond to it effectively when there's not time for Congress to meet to pass a special appropriation. Of course, the Trump presidency, as in every other case, needs to upset every tradition and statutory and constitutional understanding we've got. So he came to us and said he wants to spend several $billion, ultimately $30 or $35 billion to build the wall. We had a very vigorous, robust public debate about it. The public was on our side. Congress voted no. Should have been the end of the story. So now the president decides, okay, he wasn't able to have his way with Congress. What he's going to do is to reprogram money from other sources that we voted for other projects and other public purposes to build the wall. Well, that's an absolute violation of the Constitution, which gives us the power of appropriations and the power to spend. And it cuts directly against Supreme Court authority. The Supreme Court decided in the steel seizure case back in 1952 that if the Congress tells the president, no, you can't do something explicitly, and then the president does it, it violates the Constitution. And that's exactly the same situation here.
Not ironically, but he put in his budget to get funding for those programs that he took money from in order to pay for the wall.
Sure.
What do you anticipate Congress is going to do about those specific DOD projects?
There's a larger principle here. Congress is the primary branch of government. This is a democracy. We represent the people. We are the lawmaking power, not the president. Right. His job is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. His job is to implement the laws we pass. Of course, with the ACA, he's been doing everything in his power to try to frustrate and thwart the law, and it's the same thing here. He wants to thwart the will of Congress, which said we're not building a wall, and build it behind our backs. It's not going to work, and we will stop him in court, and we will stop him using our appropriations power.
So you can anticipate that those programs that that the money was reprogrammed from in order for him to build the wall may not get to see those refunded.
That's one possibility.
Okay.
That's one possibility. But the critical thing here is the president cannot start using publicly appropriated money for whatever purpose suits him.
It's a pretty bad precedent.
Yeah, it's a direct violation of the Constitution.
As far as the wall and the narrative again, they make it where you're either for the wall or you're for open borders, which clearly is not the case.
Right.
How do we do a better job of that issue about, he keeps using drugs as a reason for the wall, which we all know now that the press actually caught on, the drugs come through the ports of entry.
Of course.
Not through, between the ports. And the reason for that is because thousands and thousands of cargo containers come through the ports every day. And they get examined at probably less than 3%.
Yes.
So if you can get it through the port of entry, then you have free reign in the rest of the country to get that truck to the port of destination, which could be Newark, New Jersey. So if you do have illegal drugs in there, you have plenty of ample opportunity. If you just bring it between the ports, you're only going to get to the other side, and where are you going to go from there? So my question is, how can we do a better job of not just showing that he's wrong, but explaining why he's wrong to show his ignorance of the issue?
Well,
pretty clear.
That is a challenge, given that the president is doing everything in his power to demolish critical thinking skills in the public. I mean, he really doesn't want people to follow logical argument. He, of course, is not really capable of it. But yes, all of the border experts and everybody who works down there will tell you that it's the ports of entry themselves that are the ones vulnerable to shipments of drugs and other contraband. That's the place it goes through, in the containers. Right. It's not smuggled over the border and then left on the other side. Look, we've invested billions of dollars in strengthening the security at the points of entry and using drones and using other sophisticated technology to do it. That's what's going to give us a lot more security at the border, not building some 14th century medieval border wall, which is just a fantasy of the president's.
A simplistic solution by a simplistic individual.
Well, he's a builder, and I think he probably has people he would like to give the contracts to for $30 or $40 billion, but it's an absolute waste of the taxpayers' money. And by the way, we'd be tied up in litigation, not for years, but for decades with the private landowners along the border. These are Americans who are going to assert their rights against the king of eminent domain, which is Donald Trump called himself when he
Atlantic City, baby.
Yeah, he pulled the exact same stunt on the people in Atlantic City.
One last thing on the issue of the wall is he talks about funding it, Mexico paying for it because of the USMCA, the new NAFTA. And clearly, even if the USMCA gets passed and generates revenue, somehow stimulates the economy, it doesn't work its way into the general fund. So how, again, do we allow him to get away with using that as an excuse for paying for the wall?
Well, it's a difficult thing, Paul, because, I think when the president started his term, people answered every single thing he said and tried to correct him and demonstrate the errors and demonstrate that he was making stuff up. I think people got exhausted with that, and now people just let him blather on and assume that the public understands. And sadly, we're losing a space for common dialogue because there's a percentage of the population, around 40%, which seems to accept everything that the president says, no matter how nonsensical. And then there's a huge percentage of the population, probably a majority, which has made up its mind that Donald Trump is a compulsive liar, and it makes it very hard for us to have a conversation because you're on one side or the other now.
Yeah. Of course, if Mexico is paying for the wall via the USMCA, I assume that means Canada is also paying for that same wall because they're also part of the USMCA.
That's right.
Change topic. Running for president, you had indicated to me a while back, U.S. term limits versus Thornton, that the Supreme Court ruled that you can't put your qualifications for president any more restrictive than is already in the Constitution.
Yes, which are just age and citizenship. Yeah.
My question to you is, it talks about holding the office. What about running for the office? Do the states have the authority, the legal authority, to be able to put qualifications on for people entering into the primary so that they'd be running for office even though they wouldn't be yet holding the office?
Well, I mean, if you go back and look at Thornton and the other cases, I think that the court treats access to the ballot as coextensive with access to the office. So I don't think that you could get around it in that way. Now, I don't know that we don't have a directly on point case, and so some states could attempt
worth testing it, I guess.
Could attempt to do that. But I believe that Congress is going to get a hold of the president's taxes through this old statute, which has been used countless times. Congress has the power to get tax returns when it has a reason for them directly from the Internal Revenue Service.
Let's jump to the federal tax plan.
Forgive me, I think this might have to be our last question.
Okay.
If that's okay. Yeah.
Federal tax plan, you were a vocal critic from the outset. We know 83% of the benefits go to the top 1%, and it decimated the deficit. Where do you stand, number one, on as far as they're trying to attack the social safety nets, as you had indicated before. Where do you stand on raising the cap on Social Security for the payroll deduction to ensure solvency?
Yeah, I like the idea of raising the cap so that we can improve the solvency of Social Security. I don't want the message to go out that Social Security is not solvent. It's been a very solvent and financially strong program, and it will continue to be. I mean, even if we did nothing, which we shouldn't do, it would be strong for another 15 or 20 years. But what we need to do is look at raising the cap, making it a more progressive program, and also strengthening its long-term solvency. That's going to be one key to doing it. And there's some other fixes that we can do that just make perfect sense, and we can get there. Social Security is an amazingly well-run program. Less than 1% of the money goes into administration. It is there for the American people, and it's not an entitlement, as the Republicans keep calling it. It's a trust fund, and we put money in it, and we draw money back from it. It's an expression of the commitment of Americans to ourselves and to our families and to other Americans.
We'll end on one last thing on the tax plan, which is a personal issue with me. And you are a Maryland taxpayer. As a former senator at the state legislature,
yes.
Did you expect, or are you at all disappointed, or did you expect more from the state legislature to actually address the impact of the federal tax plan on the Maryland taxpayers by doing something like, at least at the state level, adding back some of those middle-class deductions that were eliminated at the federal level, or decoupling the state return from the federal return? And right now, the way it is if you take the increased federal standard, you have to take the minuscule state standard. You can't itemize at the state level if you take the standard at the federal. Did you, as a taxpayer, let alone a congressman, did you expect something to be done? It's been 2 years now that the legislature hasn't done anything.
You know, but I hesitate to blame my former colleagues in Annapolis for anything after, you know, the Republican Congress engineered that obscenity of a tax plan, which is a complete mess. People are still trying to figure out what it means in a lot of places, but the targeting of the state and local tax deduction has been a nightmare for Maryland and a lot of other states, which mostly blue states, which do a very good job of investing at the state and local level. So I hope that our colleagues in Annapolis will be doing whatever they can to figure out before the next tax season comes around what can be done to soften this blow. And I'm on legislation to try to reverse that terrible decision by the GOP Congress.
As a taxpayer. Well, I don't want to hold you up any further. I did have a question with Tony Hausner, a mutual friend, wanted me to ask you about 495, 270 widening, but I'm not going to.
Well, tell Tony he knows I'm with the program to try to slow down the governor's apparent rush to widen 495. We cannot allow people's homes and the communities.
I don't anticipate that's going to be a major issue during the debates either. But Anyway, thank you. I hope that the people running listen to this video because they will gain a lot of information if they do. So.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for what you're doing and staying such a vibrant journalistic force here.
Thanks.